our projections, again, because of the fairly significant growth in demand, and I'll touch a little more on that in a moment, and the various constraints that lead to slow or little growth in area and relatively slow growth in long-term crop yields, are that we are going to see in the long run continued strong prices, world prices, with increases ranging anywhere from 10%. This is over the full period. This is not 10% per year, for example, but as much as 50% increase in the price of maize. In meats also, we have large increases in pork and poultry, where the greatest demand is coming from, smaller increases for beef and lamb. What is the total production then that generates those kind of prices? For cereals, as you can see, even though per capita demand in most of the developing world is going up relatively slowly, again, this is for direct food consumption, there's still substantial growth in demand for livestock feeds as well. So you're seeing, for example, in developing countries, still about almost a 50% increase in demand for total cereals by 2050, and still about a 20% increase in the developed world. Again, almost all for animal feed there. Meat production, again, the demand drives very large meat production growth. As you can see, almost doubling of growth of future production required in developing countries, and about another 50% in developing countries. And here you see even in South Asia, and this meat production corresponds to meat demand in South Asia, you're seeing very significant increases in poultry consumption and production, even in South Asia, despite the significant vegetarian orientation. Again, to stress the point, per capita demand for meat is going up very rapidly in the developing world, not much anymore in the developed countries. So we're projecting from about 25 kilograms per capita now to over 40 kilograms per capita in the developing world. Again, that does put significant demand on resources. As part of the analysis, we also do an estimate of the population at the risk of hunger. These correspond conceptually with the numbers you see quoted from FAO sometimes on how many people go hungry and each year. And here again, we're seeing, again, partly because of those high prices and not fast enough production growth, we see what I regard as very slow improvements in population at the risk of hunger in the developing countries. In sub-Saharan Africa, as you can see, even a slight increase over that time. So the rapid population growth is counteracting any increases in productivity growth there and increases in income. So again, because of the prices and relatively slow growth, which is needed to generate income in these countries, we have a pretty poor performance on global food security. But just to look at alternative scenarios as well, because that's just one take on what our best estimate of where we're headed. But what happens if, in fact, we do put together significantly greater investments in crop productivity growth? And here we actually did some iterations to see what would happen if you increase productivity growth for each crop so that the projected crop price in 2050 in real terms is the same as it is in 2010. But then an alternative, in the sense of worsening, a doubling of oil prices in 2050, together, of course, higher fertilizer prices that go along with that. So what happens there, as you can see, that just by boosting that agriculture productivity alone, you get major reductions in the prices of each of the major crops. Whereas the energy shock works in the opposite direction, not quite as high a total impact, but worsens the situation significantly relative to the baseline. So again, even higher prices would be seen there. The same is true for the livestock commodities. The impacts are particularly high on processed commodities. And here we show, for example, soybeans and oils. But again, by increasing investments in productivity enhancing activities, you can substantially change that fairly negative view of the world. Those also have powerful impacts on the food security indicators because of the significantly lower prices, generates higher consumption, by poor people in the developing countries. And you can see, for example, focusing on the regions where most of the hungry are in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, you can reduce that risk of people at hunger in 2050 by 30% due to those kinds of investments. Again, the energy shock is another cause for concern. You can very substantial increases in hunger in 2050, even beyond that relatively unhappy-looking baseline. So what are some of the quick conclusions and summary of what we said? Again, in our assessment, under our best estimate of what the baseline is going to look like, that world prices of most cereals and meat will increase in real terms in coming decades, that those rising prices will slow food demand growth for poor consumers in the developing world with negative impacts on food security and well-being. And population growth is the main driver, together with demand for meat, for still significant growth in cereal demand. But we're also seeing income and rapid urbanization changing the consumption demand, particularly in Asia, but even elsewhere, towards meat and dairy, and then high-value crops like fruits and vegetables. On the supply side, again, a number of resource scarcities are going to lead to reduced yield growth rates compared to the recent decades, and expansion of area will contribute little to food production growth. There's intensified linkages we're finding between energy and agricultural markets, both through growth in biofuels production and then through the higher input costs in agricultural production, so that, as you saw, energy prices can be very significant contributors to outcomes on food security. So finally, on the energy policy side, it doesn't look like the United States or Europe is going to do away with some of the preferences for particularly the mandates for biofuels. So we do think those are here for a while, for a number of years to come. But it is possible within that to do better in terms of policies that would shift some of the ethanol production away from grains and towards lower carbon feedstocks. And some of the OECD subsidies and mandates should be reduced. In fact, the US has now reduced some of those subsidies, but maintained the mandates. But in addition, a very broad recommendation is we still have a world, particularly in developing countries, but also in many of the OECD countries besides Australia, of heavy water, energy, and fertilizer subsidies, and those distorting subsidies should be removed, with the high cost of those reinvested in things like, for example, and particularly in agriculture productivity growth. Here again, some of the key areas: agriculture research, water management, and then rural investment. Again, here I'm focusing mainly on the developing world, but particularly in the crop breeding, a lot of these apply to the developed world as well. So crop breeding, including biotech and GM, that target the biotic and abiotic stresses, climate change, and pesticides, is absolutely essential. And as we showed in that one scenario, higher investment can have very high payoffs. And then at the farm level, a lot of things are still doable. Water harvesting, precision agriculture was, in fact, a few years ago, people told me would never spread the developing country. You're already seeing laser land leveling and precision agriculture techniques being used, for example, in the Punjab in India with significant success. Minimum tillages, integrated soil fertility management, and other important investments can also improve the situation for the better. Finally, in developing countries, again, rural infrastructure investment to improve access to markets, information, credit, and inputs is absolutely essential. If you look at Africa, farmers may get only half of the price that farmers even in Latin America get for the same commodities because of the very poor state of the infrastructure. They also pay double or triple for fertilizer what they should. So enhancing roads, cell phone penetration, and a number of other things is absolutely essential. Thank you very much.